Thank you so very much for everybody for being here. Getting to host these things is just ticklingly groovy because I get to read interesting books, to watch interesting videos, and then to talk to really interesting people and be incited by ideas and being able to see how that the effect on the church. It's just really, really lovely. So thank you very much for the participants and for the people who are viewing this. It's a real privilege to be able to do this. Thank you also for New College Berkeley for hosting this and making this possible. For you who might not know about New College that much, there is a great website with a link, and I'll include that on the recording that will be coming along with this that you'll be notified about. But New College has lots of groovy events, and being connected with it is great. I see Craig there. Thank you, Craig, for making this possible. Today we have with us Dr. Mark Baker, who is the author of Centered Set Church, Discipleship and Community Without Judgmentalism. And I read the book. It's a really, really great book for pastors or for otherwise. And to make this event cooler still, we have two other pastors who are going to be talking with Mark, Dustin Maddox and Steve Joe, who have interesting stories, and some of that will come out. But something that came out to me when I was reading this book was, I'm not a pastor, and seeing the thought that goes into, something like this and dealing with people and ideas. My respect for pastors has gone up so much because of this. And you guys are such a blessing. Thank you so much for what you're doing and for dealing with people and helping us flourish. And maybe even, I thought to myself, this is kind of cheating because I'm inserting a question of my own. Maybe even someone wants to ask afterwards, how can we as people help you pastors and make your life, maybe just a little bit easier? But what really moved me when I was reading Mark's book was the constant feeling of gentleness, of care, of concern, and for love, and words that are inserted like curiosity, the importance of curiosity. And I love that. And humility and grace. God digs grace and humility. And also thank you, Mark, for putting in the stories that you did. It's easy for someone to put together something of theory, and that's more forgettable, but you actually have, it's practicable. And I'm sure there's going to be some disagreements, and maybe that will come up with Steve and Dustin and others, thoughts. Well, maybe it should be done a little bit differently, but I really, really appreciated how you put it together, the spirit that came through. Thank you very, very, very much. So for everybody, I mentioned before, this event will be recorded. If you have questions, if you can send them to admin, and then they will send them to me on another little document. If you don't want your name mentioned, then just say, I'd prefer not to have my name mentioned. Otherwise, I will mention the name. Apologies if I get the name wrong afterwards. I think that should be everything. So to get this off the ground right away, Mark, you bring up 3 key terms in your book: bounded, fuzzy, and centered. Can you please tell us about those?
Certainly. And I think, yes, I'll say a word more about this later, but these come from Paul Hebert. So they're his terms and concepts that he borrowed from Matt. But I would like to begin, rather than dive right into the concepts, put the concepts in the context of story. And so this is the same way I begin the book, and I will do it much more quickly here this evening, but my own story. So yeah, the first paragraph in the book is, I'm 6 years old, sitting in the back seat of the car on a Sunday morning, driving home from church. I look out the window and I see someone mowing their lawn. And I think, oh, this guy's not a Christian. And so there I am at, the tender age of 6, and I'm already, sort of in Pharisee sort of mindset, distinguishing between Christian, non-Christian, or, these good Christians like my family who have been to church, and this man who, obviously wasn't in church and is working on Sunday, not a good Christian. So what I'm doing there is drawing a line between, in and out, or, good and not as good. And that's this line drawing mentality. And then I continued. And so, in high school, sort of what we might call, a legalistic list of things. And I had the thing, and I was very compliant. I didn't, drink, smoke, cheat on tests at school, didn't steal on the job, and people around me were doing these things, dancing, doing drugs, and again, it was a way that functioned for me as this line of separation. And so then I went off to college, went to a Christian college, and it was a broadening experience for me. But what happened was and part of that broadening is I met people that had different sets of rules, different ideas of, what was appropriate Christian behavior. And it was a challenge to me because there were friends that were a really significant positive influence of me in my spiritual growth, but they were doing things that were on my list that would have put them on the wrong side of the line. And so, reading the Bible some, and some Pauline texts about, meat offered to idols and things like that. And I decided, I saw this, this judgmental, legalistic attitude I have. Got to leave this behind. And so this is, my early on in college. I come home at Christmas vacation, and I tell my parents, we've been legalists. I'm leaving this behind. You've got to stop. Okay, now that's a really key moment there and I remember standing in the kitchen talking to my parents, but what have I just done? So I think I've left this legalism behind. But in the very moment of doing that, what am I doing to my parents? Like, I've just drawn a line and I've put them on the wrong side of the line. You legalists changed the way I have. And so I thought I'd left legalism behind, but then, right after college, I went off to Honduras. This is in the early 80s, in a time of, significant civil strife down there. I started going to Pentecostal church, which was a new thing for me, and just a whole variety, living in, neighbors around me in extreme poverty, just give me a whole new set of things to be judging what's a good Christian and not a good Christian. And again, in my sense, I left legalism behind. But now I was looking at these other Christians, living with, much more luxury than I thought was appropriate, or not being open to the gifts of the Spirit, or on the wrong side of, supporting the Contras instead of not supporting the Contras and things like that, for those of you who have a memory of the 80s. And so, again, I'm still doing this line drawing. So, and what Paul Hebert would call this is I was operating out of a bounded group mentality. And in the book, I talk about how I had a realization of that in my mid-20s, but that's a longer story. So we'll just go with this little sort of, shortened version of my story as a background now of looking at Paul Hebert's categories. These are very, very visual concepts. And I, need a whiteboard or something. But for those of you who aren't familiar with these categories, I would encourage you to go to my website, centeredsecchurch.com, and there's a PDF there. If you scroll down just a little bit from the top, it says free PDF, and you get the drawings and the definitions that I'll refer to right now. So I'll do a little bit with my hands, but if you have those pictures in front of you, it would help a lot. So Paul Hebert was a missionary and anthropologist. And while he was a missionary in India, he asked the question, how does a church determine who belongs and who doesn't? Who are outsiders, who are insiders, good Christians and not? How do they do this discerning? And he borrowed, as I said, these concepts from mathematics. So the first we'll talk about is a bounded church. And this is what I was doing in my stories growing up. And so what a bounded church does is it creates a list of essential characteristics or beliefs. And then it looks at, do they comply with those things? Then they're on the right side of the line. They're in the circle. If they don't, they're outside of the circle. And so, back again, the 6-year-olds in the backseat of the car, that's what I was doing. I had this line, putting some people on one side of it, others, myself and others on the inside. So, but I also want to immediately say, legalism, very clear example of this. But my story also demonstrates, and the reason I tell my story is I thought I'd left legalism behind. I had left legalism behind in a certain sense, but I was just as bounded, maybe even more bounded, as a 24, 25-year-old in Honduras as I had been as a 15-year-old or, 5 or 6-year-old. So I continued to draw lines. So boundedness in the bounded group sense is not listed to legalism. And yeah, the church that I think the most bounded church that I have participated in my life was proudly not legalistic. And I was part of this. We were like, it was in Honduras. And we were so proud that we went to the movies, like unlike those other legalistic churches. And we were proud of how we had left that behind. But we looked down on those people. And that's an aspect of boundedness. It lends itself to this in, out, and this status sense of, in, out, up, down. And we use that against others. And also there were other things in our line that we use to judge ourselves and would fall short of and feel guilty. So boundedness not limited to legalism. Okay, so now boundedness and bounded churches, they have a tendency to produce judgmentalism, I've mentioned, conditional acceptance, gracelessness, shame, fear, lack of transparency, and I argue superficial ethical change. So how do we solve the problems of a bounded church? Well, the line is obviously the problem. So the way to solve it would be, get a big eraser and erase the line. And if we do that, then we get what Paul Hebert calls a fuzzy church. So with a fuzzy church, it's a bounded church, but you've erased the line. And so now the distinguishing factors of what makes this a group are now fuzzy. So it has the positive of getting rid of the judgmentalism, the looking down on others, the in-outness, the shaming in that way. But the group loses its sense of identity. And really there's not, what are you calling people to? What sense of conversion do you have? Converting to what? And then, as I, argue in the book, there are things that, we appropriately say to each other, no, like that is not a good thing to be doing. You're hurting yourself, you're hurting us, you're hurting others. Stop. But in a fuzzy church, there is not that sense of clear direction or of, confronting people when they're off in ways that are hurting themselves and others. So fuzzy church solves a judgmentalism problem, but it creates new problems. So then Hebert says there's a third option, and this is a totally different paradigm. So bounded and fuzzy, they're on the same continuum, but at different ends. But what he calls a centered church is a fully different way of evaluating who belongs. And so rather than it being in accordance with the line and status of the line, it's directional or relational. So a centered church identifies a center. So say, Jesus is in the center, and then whoever is heading toward the center, is oriented toward the center, is part of the group, belongs. And people can be at different distances from the center. They can look different, but as long as they're heading towards the center, as long as they've repented, they're oriented towards the center of God, then they are seen as part of the church. So there's this sense of, rather than drawing lines and seeing where people are in relation to lines, there's a sense of looking, has the person changed direction? Have they repented? Are they oriented toward the center? Is their loyalty to Jesus? So center set church addresses both the negative of the bounded, of that in, out, and that judgmentalism, but it avoids the negatives of a fuzzy. So briefly, those are the definitions of the concepts that are at the heart of the book.
What was the purpose? What was the story behind you getting the book, making it?
Well, thank you, Matt. I love answering that question. So when I first was introduced to this bounded, centered, fuzzy by Paul Hebert, it was just like, this is great. And I started using it in my ethics class right away in seminary, and year after year would use this. And generally, students were pretty receptive to it. And I, present these categories, got better at doing it over the years. But very often, students would ask a question like, okay, Mark, this looks good, but what do you do? What do you do about church membership? Or they would say, what do you do when? And then they would give me this situation. I've got this thing going on in my church. And I would have to say, I don't know. I came into this concept after, my missionary days and my years with campus minister with InterVarsity were behind me. I don't know. And the thing, as professor, what was frustrating, there was no book to point them to, which, us professors love to do, is say, oh, go read this book. So nothing to point them to. So finally, after a number of years of doing that, I thought, well, I would like to take care of that absence and make a book so that there could be a book that I and others could point to and say, so it's a book that, the first maybe third is descriptive, and then the last 2/3 are about application of living this out. But key thing is I couldn't write the book, right? I mean, if I can't answer the question in class, how am I going to write a book? So I went out and interviewed former students who were out seeking to apply this, including Dustin, who is here with us this evening. And so it's their stories that are, primarily in the book, more than my own of living this out, applying it.
Typically with something like this, there would be misconceptions. What would be some of the misconceptions that you want to deal with?
Yeah. So, thank you. And just real quickly, so one point of confusion is the term bounded and boundaries. So boundaries are good things. And all of us, sitting here on the screen, we seek to use boundaries in positive ways in our life in one way or another. So one misconception is for people to think, oh, we can't have any boundaries. And so I'd like to clarify, when Paul Hebert talks about bounded groups or bounded church, it's a group that is using a boundary line as a way of distinguishing who belongs and who doesn't, that has this sense of status and judgmentalism, where, if you're not using a boundary in that way, we said there's lots of boundaries in the Bible between appropriate and inappropriate. That doesn't mean, just because you have a boundary doesn't mean you're a bounded church. It's how you use that line. And then, I didn't say another thing, and this is, understandable, because for a bounded church person to let go of their boundedness, it feels like they're letting go of taking beliefs and ethics seriously. So, I like to clarify, Centered Set Church, I think, has a character that is much more welcoming than a bounded church, but it is not whatever goes, anything. It's not universal inclusion. There are things that are inappropriate in a centered church would say, that is not in line with who we are, and that we think your arrow's heading the wrong direction. And so then in a similar way, related to that, it's not that a centered church doesn't have, beliefs they hold to, rules, principles, guidelines, whatever you want to call them. It's just they're used in a different way, rather than an evaluative tool of determining who's in, who's out, who's good, who's bad. It's a tool that's helpful in discernment of helping us all get closer to the center. So those I think are three common ones that I run into a lot.
Right. I also appreciated, there was an interview I was listening to, and someone, it was kind of you clarified that the position between bounded and fuzzy, the centered set, is not somewhere, it's not the middle. It's
correct.
Right. And I appreciated that distinction. Maybe, do you want to just give like a minute on that? Because it's easy to think in terms of, political issues or a variety of things, we want to keep, the via media, we want to stick in the middle.
Right.
What you're saying it's not the middle.
Right. So this is, and I think I used the word, this is a third way option, but it's not halfway in between bounded and centered. And so it is a fully different paradigm, because both the bounded and fuzzy, they're both oriented towards using a line to define who is in or who is out. It's just that the fuzzy has made the line very fuzzy or non-existent. Whereas the centered, it's a totally other thing. It's saying, no, rather than using a line to see which side of the line people on, it's orientation. It's by borrowing a term from Megan Larissa Good, that it's about trajectory. And I think we see this in Jesus. Yeah, if I had more time, I'd go to say, Jesus talking about the tax collector and the Pharisee, and it's according to a bounded group, the Pharisee is in, but Jesus looks at trajectory. Which direction are they heading?
Yeah, thank you. Pastor Steve, Pastor Dustin, thank you very much for being in on this as well. Just a general, could you tell us a little bit about yourselves and maybe how you got to know Mark, and just some intro for the rest of us?
Go ahead, Steve. Well, I got to know Mark about 35 minutes ago on the Zoom. No, I've read his book. I'm a pastor in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I was a pastor primarily at one church and a short time at another. And then in the past, actually right after COVID, the COVID lockdown started, my wife and I and one other person started a network of small spiritual communities or micro churches. And when we were constructing this, we really wanted to do it in sort of a different way. And, there's a little story behind that. In particular, we're creating these groups for folks who don't find themselves wanting to go to a traditionally structured church. And so the centered set principle is super helpful to us in thinking about that for a variety of reasons, which I'm sure we'll get into. I came across it from in church. I'd heard the term many times before, although it wasn't really, clearly defined. And so I had some good experiences about it and bad experiences. And then I learned a lot more about it from a guy named Dave Schmelzer, who ran a group of churches called Blue Ocean Faith. Actually got to know him and talked to him about that. So that's kind of my intro into this. And we constructed our network with centered set as a very important principle. It's one of the first things we talk about and when introduce people to our community. And we spend a lot of time making people sure that they really understand that and are, know what they're getting into. Yep. I'm Dustin Maddox, and I'm a pastor in Fresno, California, so not too far away. And I first encountered these concepts and this material as a seminary student in Mark's ethics class, and immediately latched on as like these things just made so much sense of my experience as a follower of Jesus, but more particular in navigating the complexities of leading churches. And then I have since then taken on the leadership of North Fresno Church, where I got to be Mark's pastor for a season, and then begin to really workshop these ideas in our context for what it looks like to apply these in really specific ways of what a centered, how do we live out a centered set church model in a traditional church that has a history of being bounded and fear of being fuzzy. And I came to faith in what I would identify as a fuzzy church context. And so these concepts kind of gave me a way to navigate my way as a follower of Jesus to the center and the core of who Jesus is and what it looks like to pledge allegiance to him.
Thank you very much. In general, to all three of you, as pastors, you would, I assume, consider and make considerations about what the character of God is. And as I was reading Mark's book, it seemed to me that greatly evidenced were humility and mercy. Am I correct in thinking that you would need a lot of both of those, that is something that the centered set church would apply itself to? And maybe stories that you have, or
Yeah. For me, I think as a sort of heuristic, the language that Jesus, or is used of Jesus by John, is that Jesus was the fullness of grace and truth. Not partially truth, not partially grace, but the fullness, 100% truth, 100% grace. And I think bounded churches, you can even hear it in their language. Bounded churches will talk truth, 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 truth. Fuzzy churches will talk grace, 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 grace. And a centered set approach wants to talk about the fullness of grace and the fullness of truth incarnate in the person of Jesus, lived out in the people of God in this particular place. And so that's a drumbeat for us of it requires an immense amount of grace as we walk with people along a trajectory, or help people turn back around. But you need both truth to intervene and grace to walk alongside them.
I would also, I mean, yes, very true. And I would agree with that, what Dustin would share. And I'd say also the kind of relational aspect of centered set is huge, both in the relationship between a person in the community and God, and so the spiritual relationship, as well as relationship with one another, right? So in a centered church, you don't have the clarity of like, well, we all can assume everyone who's really in is at least X, Y, and Z, either in terms of beliefs or behaviors, usually select behaviors, but some behaviors. So because of that, there's this need that people actually have to get to know one another. And I actually think even in a bounded set church, that's the reality. People are in different places. So in particular, our spiritual journey with God, we're in different places. One would think that we're in different places often. And so it requires grace to be able to relate to people who aren't like you. And so I think the centered set church or centered set model creates a context for that to happen in full transparency and honesty between people. And then I think it gives the spaciousness for people to sort of be confronted with the reality of where they're at with God. What is their journey? And so that spaciousness is super freeing and helpful, which is hard. It's really hard for folks, and it's most of us, and not just in churches, but in the world, that coming from a bounded set model to embrace that. So there's like uncomfortability with it, but I think it's a really beautiful uncomfortability, and one that sort of requires grace. It requires us all to grow in grace, both between our brothers and sisters in the community, as well as in our relationship with God, as well as with our relationship with ourselves as well. So yeah, I think those things are huge.
The question makes me, so let me see how to say this. I'm always wary of, I was in a bounded church for a long time, and I was, sincere, and I think good things come out of that. And so I'm wary of being too negative about bounded, or at least people not saying, hey, wait a minute. So in this question about grace, think about, any bounded church I was in, they always preached grace. So I want to be careful to not say, centered set churches, they're grace churches, and bounded aren't. Because in a sort of doctrinal sense, most bounded churches, at least bounded churches that I was in, were always clear on the doctrine of grace. But, something I'd say in class, and I guess I say in the book too, is these paradigms themselves have power. And so in my experience in bounded churches is we would preach grace, but then we would live as if it was about works righteousness. So there's this, very, very clear, and we're saved by grace. But then the paradigm itself, when you're defining your group by this line, and then your security is in that line, it leads to undermining the lived outness of grace. Or I really like Steve's word there, space, of having that spaciousness. And so I think that the paradigm of a bounded church leads to undermining grace. And tragically, I think it's not just towards each other, which I think does happen, but also in relation to God, because although we are articulate and proclaim, a God of grace and saved by grace, that the paradigm leads to a sense of, I need to do these things in order to be in. And that can lead to viewing God as a God of conditional love. So we tend to have a lived experience that can go against the proclaimed experience.
Just having a little story related to that. I mean, as a pastor, I would say, especially in my earlier years, exactly what Mark said. We preached grace, we talked about grace, we say this is our value, this is how we want to live. Yet in our, in a lot of contexts, there's like a certain list of things that we think that if you're a really part of this community, you do and believe these things. And so as a pastor, I'm consciously or unconsciously sort of bent towards, I need to get people in this community to do all X, Y, and Z, right? And so, and those things can be very different, and that's the other kind of confusing thing about this is, what do you do about churches that have differences now with the way they set the boundaries? And that creates this conundrum as well, while everyone's also preaching grace. So, I think it's actually, I think in a strange sense, a bounded set church has a lot of clarity, but in another sense, like it's actually really unclear when you're saying one thing and then really it's another. Of course, there are some bounded set churches that, stay consistent with that. But I think Mark articulated well with the idea of preaching grace, but then having different things that we want. So, and as a pastor, like you sort of just bend yourself towards like, well, I want them to go, attend Sundays. They should be tithing. They should be doing this thing. We should be serving here. Then we want them to go through this thing. They should believe these, this set of theological things. They should be doing this set of things. So anyways, that's just a way it plays out as a pastor.
I'd like to read something. There's a quote, Mark, that you have, and it says, "The center is not a list of our beliefs about Jesus, but the person of Jesus. We will draw insights from Jesus about how to live out a centered approach. More significantly, placing the God who is revealed by Jesus at the center will help us begin to undo the negative concepts that we may have absorbed from bounded and fuzzy churches." So I'm hearing in all of you guys, it's in the name, it's Christ-centered for sure. But in terms of the personhood of Christ, so when it's brought up about, different people have different assumptions, how do you, because people have different assumptions about, well, Jesus is this, no, Jesus is that. So what do you do when differences arises that, maybe it's not necessarily, obviously for sure, scripture person would point to scripture, but sometimes it's like a person of Jesus, like, what do you do when there's like actual things that you come up against?
I've got something. I hold up the fruit of the Spirit as the character, essence, and quality of Jesus, as that which defines the center and person of who Jesus is, in the context of relationship in community. That we can have we can prioritize different attributes of the character of Jesus, or be selective in terms of the stories of Jesus that we like to tell. But the way we do that has to be consistent with the fruit of the Spirit, and has to be consistent with who Jesus is. So are we? And the language of becoming more of that is really paramount. Are we becoming more generous people? Are we becoming more patient and kind and loving and the rest as we go about that? Because if that's what's at the center, then we have no other option. Like that will just naturally be produced in us as a community gathered around that. So that's the litmus test for me. And when characteristics that are contrary to that emerge, that proves to me that something else has taken the place of the center. And we have to figure out how to unearth that and put Jesus back in his proper place.
Yeah, I'll jump in too, because I've heard that one of the amazing things about centered set is that it's incredibly dynamic, and it's actually pretty rigorous, because it's not like I can just check the boxes. Like, I believe all the stuff that this church believes. And I do, I come on Sundays, I do what I'm supposed to do, which again, that's like different in every community. And I'm good. It's sort of a continual, rigorous sort of check of, am I becoming more Christ-like? Am I moving towards God? Like, am I truly facing this way? And so, it's sort of secondary evidence. So that's the thing that's a little bit harder about centered set, sort of way of doing things. It's not like, well, I'm attending the class, so therefore, or I intellectually say I believe this, so I'm good, right? It's like, no, I can intellectually say that I think we should become more forgiving. And meanwhile, I'm not forgiving anyone. In fact, I'm vengeful, right? Like, so the check is in reality and it's real time and it's always happening. So in a centered set context, like even someone who is in like really close to the center, they do all the right things, they believe all the right things. It doesn't matter where you are. It's always, are we moving towards Jesus? Are we going where Jesus is going? And so, yeah, fruit of the Spirit is sort of evidence. There's this like after effect evidence of it, that, and so it is a little less clear, and it's a little like, it takes some time to see that play out. But I think it's sort of, if you think about it, in another context, this is like, it's like results oriented. It's not just, did I do the things or do I believe the right things or whatever it might be. So that's one of the things I really love about centered set is it's dynamic, it's real time, it's always happening. And we need that feedback. There's that constant feedback. Am I connecting with Jesus? Is Jesus in my life? Am I understanding my work and faith, in a continual way that points me towards Jesus and what Jesus talked about, kingdom of God in the scriptures and et cetera. And, that's not easy, but that's why you need community to do as well.
I think, so on one hand, where can we not be, compromising? And so, and as aware, in writing the book, I'm writing this book for people across the theological spectrum. So I wanted to be very careful about not making this a book that would only work, for my tribe, so to speak. So in that sense, to be centered, it's very clear that Jesus is at the center. And I would say an important point, and I appreciate you bringing this up, Matt, that these diagrams by themselves will not produce a centered church. So if someone's or if a group's concept of God is of a overbearing, accusing, finger-pointing deity, then I could draw as many circles and arrows and stuff as I want, but their experience of church will be bounded because the God of their center is bounded, right? So that's what I think. It's very important in a centered thing to not only present the concepts, but to work to make sure people are experiencing back to the previous question, the gracious God of the center. But then after that, I think there can be disagreement. So for churches need to define what all constitutes their center. And I'll share something that someone shared at when I was doing a seminar at this last year, and he's had the idea. I said, think of like a Venn diagram. And so in a church, there can be we can have differences, but then there's this common area, and in that common area in the center of the Venn diagram, that's something that we all agree on, and we say that's part of our center. That we recognize there are other things that we have differences about, but we're accepting that that's okay. We can have those differences. But I think that's something that individual churches, groups, denominations would need to work at. But I think it's a very important point that there doesn't have to be necessarily broad universal agreement on all sorts of concepts or ideas about Jesus, but there definitely needs to be the agreement that Jesus, the character of Jesus is the character of the God of the center. And as Dustin pointed out, the scene of the fruit of the Spirit.
the fruit of the Spirit thing is it's such a great answer, because it's pretty difficult for someone. And then, the attributes, the becoming, Dustin, you mentioned generous, kind, loving, these things are essentially, are we fruiting properly? Are we fruiting? And I think people know, like, at least we know to some degree, and we can all have our certain, this is the most important thing. No, this is the most important thing. But there's also those fundamental issues of, okay, are we fruiting? Are we becoming? I love that. I just love that so much.
Yeah, I think something that has come to me over time of trying to live in and live out of a centered set approach is, Steve's word of spaciousness really, I think, captures some of the essence of the idea of how we hold our positions is as important as the positions that we hold. And you can, when we agree that Jesus is the center, we can do some sort of theological triage from around that and say there are certain things that we can just hold together with open hands and be generous and hospitable towards each other as we do that, while never compromising the core of the gospel of the kingdom that Jesus reveals as the God of the center.
Something when it comes to judgment, Mark, that you're talking about Father Gregory Boyle, who is a great favorite. I've listened to, and I love the fact that he does the audio of it, and I've listened to that numerous times and generally cry at least once. And I've said to other people, if you read that book and you don't cry, you're either not human or you're a bad person. That's being judgmental of me, I realize, but it's just great. So when it came up, but this, you say, Boyle advocates for compassion in terms of when there is something to be judgmental of. And you say, he observes that the ultimate measure of health in any community might well reside in our ability to stand in awe of what folks carry rather than in judgment of how they carry it. Now, that's obviously needs a little bit more unpacking. You want to say a little bit more about that in terms of dealing with judgmental issues?
Yeah, and so Father Boyle's example, points a very concrete, I think easy to grasp example of it is he's working with gang members, former gang members, and and then he's going to say all of these people that he works with have just tremendous trauma and things that they have dealt with in their past. So he's saying let's bring that into mind. And so then again, I think point to the paradigms, they matter, because a bounded set church, there's intense pressure to guard the line. And so the important thing becomes the line itself. And so if someone transgresses the line, then the pastors or leaders of the church, there's great pressure to make an example of the person, to call them out, because we have to keep the clarity of the line, and we have to keep our definition, that who we are, and it needs to be pure. So it's not that people in a bounded set church, aren't compassionate people, but again, the centered set creates space to be compassionate, so that rather than just immediately being judgmental, you can then have compassion, which then leads to curiosity, like, oh, well, what's going on and why this? So I think compassion and curiosity are closely linked, and then creativity. So then how do we respond to this? Whereas, I think the bounded set would tend to cut that off. And then, I'd be curious, what you might say about fuzzy, but I think, a fuzzy church would be more, just hesitant to even enter into the thing. So they're because of fear of making the person feel bad or something. So it might never get to the curiosity or creativity.
Oh, I was just going to say a couple of things on that. So one of the things when we teach this to folks in our community, I often like to bring up the Ted Lasso. I think it's actually a misquote of Walt Whitman, but that's fine. Scholars can look that up. Be curious, not judgmental, because that's like so huge, right? Like in the bounded set model, it pushes you to not, even if you want to be curious, it's like, well, you're curious, but really we got to get them across the line, whatever that might be. Whereas in a centered set model, you don't have that pressure. So you might tend to be more just interested in where is this person at? What's going on? What's the story? Because the goal is to orient people towards Jesus. And in order to effectively do that, you have to know intimately and personally where that person is at. Another tool that's really helpful in combination with centered set is something broadly known as stage theory, right? Which is just that there are different stages to people's spiritual journey. It's really useful to know where someone is at in their spiritual journey before, saying, hey, you got to do this or do that, right? Because what's going to actually be helpful for someone to move towards Jesus, it's, really depends on where they're at. So that's an important distinction. And one other thing that Mark said that made me think of one metaphor that I'd heard about this once, I can't remember where, but is that a bounded set model is a lot like, trying to keep a herd of sheep or goats or cows or whatever you want, keep them in your pasture by building a huge fence, which is very expensive. Fences take a lot of maintenance; they break down, and then what you end up having to do as a pastor, and I definitely relate to this, is you got to go like patrol the fences. You have to make sure there's no holes in the fences. You're spending all this time thinking about the fences, the boundaries, right? And as a pastor, there's people that do that. They want to make sure that you're, like Mark said, making an example of someone who's not, you can't be approving of someone who's sinning and blah, 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 right? Like, and it's just so much focus is on those boundaries and you lose focus on what's the center. Whereas another model, a metaphor for centered set would be that you keep your herd of goats or sheep or whatever by having a well at the center of your land, right? And so the animals are attracted to the water. They stay near the water. They don't wander off because something that's good, that's life-giving, that's important, draws them to there. So that's just a different kind of way of, I think pastors and leaders have sort of just maybe unconsciously bent as well. So I would definitely affirm that aspect of what Mark's sharing.
So if we were to use some more C words to compassion, curiosity, I think if we were to shift kind of psychologically, the temptation in a bounded set environment is in a relational system is to cut off, because any transgression risks the sinful contagion contaminating you, and so you have to cut off from that person. In a fuzzy set, the temptation or risk psychologically or relationally is towards codependence, to facilitate somebody's dysfunction because of your own to manage your own anxiety. And I think that's because what's at the center of a fuzzy set is the individual. And the individual is the authoritative center of a fuzzy set. And so there is no real intervention because unless it's towards an identified out group, but there's no intervention because it risks somebody stepping onto my turf where I'm sovereign, and so that becomes a challenge of a fuzzy set, and why the lines get blurred in other ways that don't produce fruit as much as a centered set would promote.
I'm curious, do I want to make, Mark, is it everybody's good? Okay. In terms of increasing that sense of curiosity, I think it's a wonderful thing. Is there any, and this is kind of off script, but as pastors,
it doesn't have to be from that perspective, but like what would you say about inciting curiosity about others? And as you said, Dustin, it goes along with compassion. But how do we what would you say to increase that sense of curiosity?
I mean, in our communities, we actually, try to teach explicitly like how to be a good listener.
Okay.
We actually sometimes we'll have, we often have groups do story sharing, right? So, in the story sharing time, we'll have curated rules for that story sharing time. One of which is like, it depends on what they're sharing, but one thing is, confidentiality, so creating that safe space. Another thing is, for some of the stories, we literally tell people like, hey, you can ask them clarifying questions, but otherwise, all you need to do is just say thank you, right? You don't need to like offer advice. You don't need to relate a story of your own, right? And so we're trying to teach people to be good listeners and to ask, good questions that are not trying to, shape a person, but more just really fully understand what the person's saying first. Being able to ask like, am I hearing that this is what you're saying, or is this what, doing those checks and stuff. So, we actually really teach sort of listening skills to help people learn to be curious and actually have to model it, which by the way, like as a pastor, that was a little bit of a shift for me, right? Like in a more balanced model, my job is to get you to believe this or think this or do this. And, in a sensitive model, I do want to do certain, help people along that journey, but I first need to really listen and understand and after it. So it was a shift for me to do that. But it's been really wonderful. And yeah, I think very helpful to be able to foster that in myself and then in our own community as well.
I think, at least from a pastoral perspective, I have to be curious in order to model what curiosity, what this type of approach looks like. So I have to do the work of actually following Jesus myself, so that I'm attentive to what Jesus is up to in the midst of a conversation or a meeting or a service, to try and draw attention to what's happening in that moment. And I have to become aware of my own story to the extent that it would try and tamp down that curiosity, because it doesn't feel, it feels like a threat to my sort of internal navigation system, and allowing the story of Jesus to kind of displace the stories that my brain or my body are telling me in a given moment. And I think the way I think about that is, I think traditionally the one of the names for the Spirit is the Advocate. One of the names for the Satan Satan actually means accuser. And so trying to lean into the spirit of advocacy is to place Jesus at the center rather than the spirit of accusation, which will come up, and I think is a temptation particularly around bounded communities. But that's some of the ways I think about curiosity in my own life and leadership.
Yeah, I appreciated both what Steve and Dustin said, and the only thing I think I will add is, well, yeah, the intentionality. And so to work at becoming a good listener includes having good questions. So like, and page 164, 165 of the book, I list, I don't know, a dozen questions that I borrowed from people that they said they commonly use. And I think even this is something that congregation can develop a habit in. So I don't think this one's in the book, but Dan Serdahl from a church up in Washington where, they're just constantly asking, what's your next step? And so that's inviting curiosity in the person, like, what's God doing? What's your next step? But then from the pastor or leader's stance also, it's not telling them what they ought to be doing. Well, what's your next step? But, questions of, what feels heaviest in your life right now? What needs are you trying to meet through this thing you're doing? Where is God working? Where would you like Jesus to heal you first? So questions that, rather than pronouncing things and then they're developing a habit. Or, I remember, one former student pastor of saying, regularly in their leadership meetings, when they come into a problem, they ask the question, okay, how can we handle this in a centered way? And so that then invites that reflection rather than just kind of going with default habits.
This is all really, really, this is really, really interesting. And especially with them, you've done a really good job in terms of, again, I'm not a pastor, but I think this is interesting for everybody to listen to. I'm finding this so interesting. Speaking of good questions, unless we want, is there any final statements, or can we move into question time? Okay.
I would just say that, I know we're talking about this a lot in the context of church and church leadership, but in my opinion, this is a discipleship paradigm, period. This is for anyone who's seeking to find and follow Jesus and place their life on a trajectory towards becoming like him and doing the things that he did. And so it gets, we think of the concepts in terms of navigating church life, but really these are paradigms through which we can engage through which a follower of Jesus can approach following Jesus.
Yeah, if I could just add a sentence to that. Last May, another former student invited me to speak at his church, but in the way that Dustin was just saying, okay, I want you to talk about discipleship and how as individuals can we be living in centered ways. And it kind of struck me, and I realized, whenever I talk about this, I do what we've done this evening, is I always talk about groups and communities. And it was an interesting exercise to think, okay, how do we treat ourselves in centered ways? Just to affirm what Dustin was saying. And if you're curious what I said that time, I think I made a little video afterwards, just condense it down into 13 minutes, and it's on, I have another website that's profmarkbaker.com, and it's on the list of videos somewhere.
I will include, there'll be links in the bottom, so I will include, and anything, Dustin or Steve, that you wish to add to that is helpful, send that to me, and I will include that in the description. Thank you very much again. It's very, very interesting. Okay, so we have from Cheryl Garlick. I wonder if Mark can say something about how the center set concept might be understood or applied by folks of different cultures or ethnicities.
Yeah, so my memory is not as sharp on this, but the book that I had written before this one was Ministering in Honor Shame Cultures, which I co-authored with someone who knew a whole lot more about that than I did. But we actually included bounded and centered and fuzzy in that book because we thought it was a helpful aid. And maybe it goes back to, Steve's word again of spaciousness. So I think, centered can be messier, but it can also be less dangerous. And so I think, I experienced this in my missionary experience in Honduras. I saw the fruits of bounded set religiosity come in and, impose a set of rules that made sense in, suburban Chicago or, suburban Los Angeles, wherever. But, in rural Honduras, didn't. So on one hand, positively, I think centered set creates spaciousness. And even, that's the origin of it was, go back to the story of Paul Hebert. I mean, he's trying to figure out, in the context of India, how do I know when someone is a Christian? And so what worked for him in central Kansas of, have you prayed and accepted Jesus Christ as your Savior? He's now in India, and people were quite willing to say, accept Jesus and put Jesus up on the shelf with their other gods. And so it leaves him kind of scratching his head of, well, yeah, this isn't working, but okay, they said this, but how? So yeah, even in its origins, it was cross-cultural. So I think it creates space for more respect, openness, curiosity. The other thing I would say, though, is, and again, this is more from having learned from my co-author, like even the section of the book, I have a chapter on loving intervention. And I would be pretty hesitant to give that to someone, doing mission in Japan, for instance, and say, this is the way to do loving intervention in a centered set church. Like, loving intervention in different cultures could look really different. So I'd be very positive about the concept, but yeah, hesitant, cautious, humble to say we could take examples from the book from Canada or the United States and put them anywhere. But I'm quite open to hear thoughts from others on the panel or on the screen on that. Thanks, Cheryl. Good question.
I mean, personally, I think it's a good centered set is a helpful model in a multicultural context, precisely for the reason that it sort of helps us detach cultural things that we have attached to Jesus in our boundaries, right? So, like, what does it mean to be a Christian? In some cultures, and say in America, it means you vote a certain way or you dress a certain way, right? And like, or you worship in a certain way, right? And that helps us sort of hold on to those things a little bit more loosely, and maybe ask more of the question, like, what are the things, what helps us orient and move towards Jesus? So I think it's just helpful in that sense. Even I was just thinking, that example of Mark just shared, about what does loving intervention look like in different contexts. Like, well, you don't have to take the culture into context, but it's for the aim of moving people towards Jesus, not for the aim of, fitting into some kind of cultural norm that may or may not be doing that. And in a multicultural context, I think that's a really good skill too, because now we need to understand people are coming in with different contexts and different understandings of what that means. So we have to understand, what does it mean to move towards Jesus, orient yourselves towards Jesus, for someone in their own context.
And one of the other primary avenues that Mark uses to teach this is through Galatians. And his commentary on Galatians really crystallizes how centered set creates space for a multicultural community to coexist beyond the boundaries of their cultural or ethnic priorities that are in competition in a multi-ethnic, multicultural space. So it really is it's a Swiss Army knife of a concept that is deeply and profoundly incarnational, that you can just step into a community and begin to see, okay, there's some boundedness, there's some fuzziness. How can we draw people towards the center and set this particular community and the people therein on the trajectory towards the center. And Galatians and Mark's commentary specifically helps us do that.
Sylvia Chin asks, curious to know, this is a big question. Curious to know if there are any weaknesses to the censored set model.
Just to get us started, I mean, I think things are, well, I mean, looking at the other way, what are advantages of the bounded set? I mean, a bounded set, it's certainly clear, I mean, what this community is about, and you know your standing, right? So in that sense, there's clarity. Now, that clarity can cut a lot of different ways. I also think in a bounded set church, they tend to be there's maybe a little bit more like excitement and vigor towards the mission of that church, because like, these are my people, this is my tribe, this is what we're doing, right? So it might be a little bit easier to mobilize people in a bounded set. And so, I mean, conversely, in a centered set church, these are kind of generalities. So I don't know, I wouldn't say this is true of all centered sets, but you have to kind of like, you have to be curious, you have to get to know people, you have to, understand, right? So it maybe is slower. I would still maybe make the argument, though, that this is a better way towards discipleship and towards, moving people towards Jesus, and ultimately moving people towards Jesus's mission. So in a balanced church, like you better hope that the church's drive and aim and mission is in line with Jesus's mission. And sometimes they are, sometimes it's not, or portions of them aren't, right? Like, so I definitely think there's some of that. So, I mean, yeah, but maybe as a generality, I'd just say, I think the centered set way of doing things is maybe a little bit slower, but I think it kind of is deeper. So I'd definitely say as like a pastor, right? Like the process is slower towards like integrating people, the process is slower towards getting people excited and involved. You have to explain this, particularly because we live in a really bounded set culture. I mean, again, beyond churches, like it is a different way of thinking, right? And it takes people a minute to get to that as well. So yeah, I mean, that's one aspect I'd say is a weakness. It's slower.
Yeah, and the slowness is the obstacle that, in my experience, a disadvantage of centered set is that for people who come from bounded communities, centered set seems fuzzy. And for people who come from fuzzy communities, centered set seems bounded. And it takes time some people grasp it intuitively, and it's freedom, like, I get it. But for others, especially who are like, wait a second, you're the enemy that I've heard of for so long. It takes time for them to let their guard down and open their hands and say, okay, I'm open to this because I see Jesus in it, and I see the fruit that's being born in my life. But I'm a massive fan of centered set, so that's my only critique.
Yeah, just to say, to ditto what they said, I remember one time presenting this in Peru, and at the end, a pastor stood up and said, I was skeptical at first, but you've convinced me. And then he said, this is going to make my life much more complicated. It's much easier to stand up and just make pronouncements. Now I'm going to have to, get to know people. And yeah, so it's slower and requires more. And I really appreciate Steve's observation about going against culture. And then to bring that to Dustin, it's both ways. I mean, our society is both, very, very bounded right now in ways. But in the other way, like that Dustin mentioned, with the individual at the center, there's a lot of, fuzziness, tolerance of supreme virtue still in society. So those two, but there's not a lot of centeredness, directionalness in society.
Yeah, that makes me think of when I was learning about this from this guy, Dave Schmelzer. He ran a large, at the time, is like in the 90s, a relatively large church. And one comment he made to me, which was interesting, was that he actually found that once they developed this culture of centeredness, that people actually had more robust conversations around things that were divisive and disagreements, like theological things, because the stakes are lowered, right? Like, you're not afraid that you're going to be like outed or you're going to be pushed on the outside. Whereas I would share, one church that I worked in, it was there was like kind of a fear to talk about stuff that's divisive, right? Because I don't want to, have to like decide that you're in or out, or I don't want to say something that would push me on the outside, or, let's just avoid it, right? I do think there are very hard-bounded churches that would tell you everything, but probably the reality is a lot of churches or a lot of people in churches, like, they don't want to have division, so they just don't talk about stuff. And in a third set community, you have a little bit more freedom and space to talk about things that you might disagree with someone. But again, it's not like, okay, now I have to disown you. It's like, no, we can have some disagreement about this and still live with each other and still, and then hopefully, I think in the ideal world, like, maybe now come towards a more robust agreement or learning from each other where we, could, because it's been tested and tried by true discussion without fear of being pushed out or whatever.
A thicker question. Hopefully I get this right. Would you discuss handling individuals whose behavior is outside of the Christian norm? In my former church, a member whose unborn child was poisoned by her prescription had a medically indicated therapeutic abortion and endured shaming and church discipline in addition to her personal trauma. In the same church, another member had an elective abortion, reported it as a miscarriage, and was able to continue her church participation in good standing. How to uphold Christian standards without shaming and secrecy.
First off, like, this is a very sad thing to read to me, and both situations. But I think this example actually shows some of the virtue of a centered set thing where, in theory, in the first instance, it's that shaming and, that wouldn't be there, right? Like, there wouldn't be the pressure to shame and make an example of this person. And in the second instance, it's exactly the thing. Like, well, this person sort of did the thing to keep them in the boundaries, which is, reporting it as a miscarriage. Like, well, miscarriages are okay according to these boundaries. But meanwhile, inside, they're there's this whole other thing happening. So, in that sense, I would say that if you had a truly centered set world, I think that would help avoid this in the sense that people could feel free to be more honest without fear of being shamed. So, that's just a starting point. Obviously, those are both very complicated situations and, would require a lot of pastoral care and a lot of curiosity about what's going on and whatnot. And the hope would be for both people, I think, in those situations that whatever caused both those things that, for those people, that the goal of the community, the goal of the faith would be to bring them towards those situations, towards Jesus, for whatever that means. But I think this is actually a great example why bounded churches create some hard situations.
I'm coming to learn that in situations like this, centered set isn't a silver bullet. That will prevent situations like this from ever happening in our communities. The hope, however, is that it would form the types of mature followers of Jesus who, in instances of shame and exclusion, step in front of that shame and exclusion in order to draw it away from the person that the community is trying to shame and exclude.
Thank you. Just a couple comments. Yeah, I love where you started at, Dustin. And it made me also think many of us who have had bounded church experiences, we bring a lot of boundedness with us. So even, I may be in a situation where the pastoral team, small group leaders or whatever, are doing a great job of, doing things to avoid shaming. But yeah, I'm still bringing it with me. So yeah, the main thing I want to say is that is an excellent question. And one of the things that, going back to why did I write the book, that motivated my book, because that was the sort of thing that students were asking me and I didn't know what to say. So there are quite a number of examples in the book. And I'll just tell one quickly from Dan Whitmarsh, a pastor up in Washington State, former student. And he told us, so there was a man who had been attending the church, and then this man started going out with the woman. They weren't married. They started living together. The woman started attending a church as well. And this is problematic against standards. And Dan says he felt like the bounded set voices saying just the kind of thing I said earlier, like, hey, deal with this, make this clear. But he's seeking to resist. Anyways, he meets with a group of leaders from the church and okay, how do we respond to this situation? And so they're talking about it. And then one person said, hey, these people, there's a lot going on in their life. Why are we talking about just this one thing? I think we should get, a couple from the church to walk with them and, seek to walk with them, disciple them, etc. And they say, hey, that's a great idea. How about if you and your wife do it? And they did. And so what, Dan recounts in the stories in the book is, there were a whole number of things going on in these people's lives that needed reorientation, redirection. And the first and most significant was not actually that they get legally married. And so it was more of a sense of let's walk with them, see how the Spirit leads. And so Centered allowed that kind of space. And today, they are both still in the church and they're married, but that wasn't where they started of just, okay, let's get these people married and we've taken care of it. So I think this points to the possibility of, deeper transformation and hopefully with less shame.
Ruth Myers asks, how do you think about sacramental practices, baptism and communion, Eucharist in a centered set church? How does that contrast with bounded set churches?
I think of, in church history, how the sacraments have been fenced. That's literally the language that has been used. And I get that has been a necessity in seasons to promote the integrity of what we hold as integral to our practice. But just speaking for me in our context, something that we talk about baptism as the beginning of your journey towards becoming, and then around communion, the invitation is to the table for anyone who is wanting to be drawn in more and more to Jesus. If you are interested in starting to follow Jesus, come and talk to somebody. But the invitation is to the table, to the person, to the bread and the cup, and isn't a barrier of entry. And as a couple of weeks ago, we had a teenager who hadn't been baptized take communion for the first time, and then they're like, wait, we want to be baptized. And that, so the way that those things mutually reinforce each other in the sort of trajectory paradigm of a centered set is I think a gift that it offers in terms of sacrament.
Yeah, I would definitely resonate with what Dustin just shared. And I mean, in some senses, like these sacraments or these rituals or these things, they're like recentering activities, right? Like they return us to the story of Jesus. They return us to Jesus's sacrificial love or towards the story of reconciliation, right? So I mean, I think those things are all there, and in order to get there, or even with baptism as an invitation to this journey, right? Like it kind of push us to understand the depth and the richness of what those sacraments mean versus like, I got to check the boxes, right? Like to be a good Christian, I have to get baptized, I have to take Lord's Supper, right? Like it's just a different attitude and orientation towards those things.
Yeah, and just to add, that if you go back to the diagram of a centered set, the point is orientation. And so if, the arrows are representing heading one direction or another, so repentance, conversion is required in a center. It's not fuzzy, and so in that sense, baptism is a great centered act. It's affirming that, and I guess I'd just say that go back to the first thing Dustin said. I mean, these things all have great potential to be done in bounded ways and are done in bounded ways and experienced in bounded ways. So therefore, it calls for us to, with intentionality, frame these things in centered ways, and with intentionality, use centered language around them to recover and give them that sense of trajectory and not boundedness.
And one more thing that came to mind is the walk to Emmaus story, I think, gives us the biblical imagination for this. It's, the two disciples walking away from Jerusalem. So there's an orientation away from the center. Jesus meets them and journeys with them even further away from the center. And then there becomes this turning point moment where there's a reorientation around the scriptures, and then the sacrament is presented to them. They receive it. Their eyes are reawakened to Jesus, and they go running back towards the center. So that's something that's captured my imagination for centered set stuff.
We technically have 2 minutes left, but I want to be respectful of your time because I know we have people from different time zones. There's one more question. Are we okay with that? Okay. This is from Russell. How does being centered set work when it comes to church leadership? Let's say you're recruiting small group leaders. Would you require them all to be baptized Christians, as well as hopefully growing in the fruit of the Spirit? So even in a centered set church, won't there be bounded sets?
Let me say something definitionally, and then I'm hoping that Dustin and Steve could say something about actually carrying it out. So, and I talk about this in a section in the book, and make the acknowledgement, depending on how you define bounded, you could say, yes, within a centered church, there are bounded groups, leaders. So, perhaps out of stubbornness, but I choose not to, in saying, well, if these lines don't have the character of, superiority, inferiority, us, them, then it's not a bounded set. And so yes, you can have standards, but to seek to apply them in centered ways. And as I said, I hope that, Dustin or Steve had some examples of how to do that.
So I think this question points to the distinction that Mark drew, that bounded and boundaries are different. And one of the qualifications, or one of the metrics of evaluation is trajectory towards the center, and that comes with increasing maturity. Steve brought up stage theory. So it's these these evaluative things are not eliminated when it comes to the practicalities of leadership in church. And so we're looking for the evidences of the fruit of the Spirit in people's lives. We are connecting people who are less mature with people who are more mature and trying to facilitate their movement towards maturity so that they can connect with people who are less mature and draw them forward. And so there are going to be mechanisms within a community that promote the center. And a way of thinking about centered set with a garden analogy is it's not that a garden will centered set is like a garden with a white picket fence around it, with a gate that you can see through. There's holes, but there's a gate that you have to enter in. You have to enter through to get into the garden. But even within the garden, there are planter boxes that promote and preserve the health of the particular plants in or flowers within the garden. But at the center is the well from which all of the potential fruit from this garden is dependent. And so there all of that plays into the practicalities in at least as I try and lead our community.
Yeah, just real briefly. I mean, in my view, it's pragmatic, right? Like, it's not about a boundary or a bounded set within a set. It's like who is effective at helping people move towards Jesus, and who has the skills in particular roles, right? Right. I mean, I probably wouldn't have someone, leading music who's never played music before. I don't necessarily think that's I'm not like kicking them out because they can't play music. That's just not the role they play. So if I'm climbing Mount Everest, I'd probably want a Sherpa going with me, right? And that's not a matter of me excluding someone from, hiking Mount Everest. It's like I want someone to guide me who can show me the way. So, anyways, that's how I look at it.
Well, this was very lovely, lovely, lovely. Thank you so, so very much for this. As a person, again, who doesn't know all that much about these technical details, and it was mentioned previously, I'm not sure if it was Dustin or Steve, about, these are actually issues that it's not just pastor issues, it's all of us issues. It's Christian community, it's Christians, in order for us to fruit better, to be curious, all of these things. Thank you so, so, so very much for this. And of course, Mark, for writing the book, and this has all been really, 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 really enjoyable. Thank you. I will make a link available, and for all the participants, the questions, sorry there was some missed. This was lovely. Thank you so very much again.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thanks, Steve and Dustin.
Yeah, thank you, Mark.